The NZXT H7 series of cases released a few months ago and ended up being a nice little shake-up from cases that we'd seen from them in the past, which, let's not beat around the bush, ended up with not having the best airflow, shall we say. So with that, NZXT released the H7, H7 Flow and H7 Elite, and in typical case manufacturer style, they're now releasing the smaller brother, the H5 series. And we have both the Flow and Elite models here, because in a strange but sensible turn of events, they've actually ditched the normal solid panel version on this range. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. I wish these files would transfer faster. Come on! Whoa, is that the Acoustics 510 NVMe drive with its blistering fast speeds of 3450 megabytes a second read, 3200 megabytes a second write, and capacities of up to 2 terabyte? I can have these files transferred in no time. And if I'm looking for the ultimate performance, I could even get the 4th generation Acoustics 520. I better check the link in the description to find out more details. So let's start by talking about the range. Unlike the H7, NZXT have decided to completely ditch the solid panel version, which was something I criticised when they originally released the H7 lineup, as it just didn't really make much sense. While the Flow with its mesh design for improved airflow and Elite with its stylish RGB just did. So that's what we have here. And in another turn of events, they've also ditched the black and white contrasting version in favour of just 2 colours, either black or white. Now, I guess having the sales data on what works and what doesn't from the H7 allowed kind of NZXT to make some important decisions about what they'd actually bring to market with the H5. Personally, I think they've made some good decisions, and with a case that's kind of due to replace the H510, it's going to be interesting to see what's changed. Now, from a first glance, it looks like they've utilised the size very well, as it's a mid-tower and is slightly bigger than what the H510 series was, but not by much, and is still on the, let's say, smaller scale compared to similar cases on the market. Now, even though it is on the smaller scale, it's still able to accept up to an ATX size motherboard, CPU coolers with height of up to 165mm and GPUs up to 365mm. So those wanting a shiny 4090 won't be disappointed, apart from the big hole left in their wallet from buying the card in the first place, of course. Now, the design is pretty much what you'd expect. Imagine a H7 from the outside, just shrunk down slightly. And if going for the Flow, you'll get a large perforated front panel, while the Elite plumps for tempered glass. Though one interesting thing is the fact that the Elite comes with a side panel on the right with extra perforation for added airflow, while the Flow just doesn't. Same thing on the H7. Why NZXT don't just ditch the solid panel and use a perforated one for all of the models? Well, I just don't know. It would likely actually cut down on cost too. Now, as you'd expect as well, the black versions of the case both have tinted glass, while the white has clear glass. Beyond that, we have a single USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A port, the same as a Type C port, and an audio jack. So nothing has really changed there from the previous H510 series. There's also a removable magnetic dust filter on top, but other than that, the 2 cases are pretty typical of what you'd expect. Very similar in design to the H7 series, but similar in size to the H510 series. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Shows that NZXT have kind of learnt a lot from previous and current product lineups. Though it's a small case, the inside just somehow feels bigger and comes with some pretty unique features, like the angled fan, which acts as a bottom intake, which I'm going to say I've never seen before, and I'm kind of liking it. Whether it adds any function over style, we'll see when we get to testing both cases later on, but at least from a style standpoint, it's a winner in my book. Couple that with a 240mm AIO in the top, and you're laughing. Now, talking of cooling, you do have some options with space for up to 2 140mm fans in the front, 2 120mm in the top, and a single 120mm in the rear, and of course, a single 120mm angled in the bottom. Now, when it comes to pre-installed fans, the H5 Flow comes with 2 F120Q fans, with one of them being in the rear and the one in the bottom, while the H5 Elite comes with the same F120Qs in the bottom, but mixes things up with 2 F140 RGB fans, which are both installed in the front. Now, one area of criticism comes down to that angled 120mm fan, which gets all of its airflow from the gap between the case and the surface it's sitting on, whether that be a desk or, the floor. Now, I'm not a case designer or engineer by any means, but surely having at least on the Flow version, a panel that was maybe perforated here would have assisted in airflow, just, with a bit of a redesign, as there's almost like a wind tunnel angled down to assist with airflow. Now, sticking with airflow, I'll be honest, and it's a big criticism of mine from the get-go, but the stock configuration on both the Flow and the Elite are loud. It can all be controlled through NZXT CAM or your BIOS, but it just puts you off a bit when first building your system. But we will talk about acoustics and temperatures in a little bit. Now, other control comes on the Elite with a built-in RGB controller that has 3 lighting channels, which is great for adding in another device like the T120 RGB air cooler that we've used here. But that does come with an NZXT to ARGB adapter, which kind of begs the question as to why ARGB standard headers aren't used in the first place. Now, for those wanting to install radiators, you have the ability to install up to a 280mm in the front, 240mm in the top, and a 120mm in the rear. Though pump placement, unless using something like the eTeknix FLT D5, well, it may be a bit of an issue. Another point is that if you're adding a radiator into the front, you will lose space for your GPU, so just be aware of that. Now, around the rear, we still have a decent amount of cable management, which is kind of expected, I guess, from NZXT, as they always seem to have a bit of a builder mindset when designing their cases. And we find plenty of tie-down loop points, including Velcro cable ties, and a lot of room for pushing cables out of the way as well. There's also a removable bracket that can be used to install 2 2.5-inch drives or a single 3.5-inch drive, which, while it doesn't sound like much, with the way that the market's been heading as of late, it's kind of perfectly acceptable for a case of this size. There's also enough room for power supplies up to 160mm in length, with kind of leaving yourself a good amount of room for cable management. Though you could potentially fit a larger, say 185mm long PSU in, but you may struggle with room for cables as it starts to feel a bit cramped with only 30mm or so left for cables. Now, 2 other things I want to touch on is that NZXT haven't taken my point on board about dust filters. Yeah, I know. As we actually find a small one in the rear below the PSU and the same towards the front. While like other brands, they could have just had a single dust filter that spans the whole bottom of the case. Though, I guess it's not a deal breaker by any means, it's just a weird observation by me. The other thing comes down to if wanting to vertically mount your GPU, which is possible, though you'll need to buy NZXT's vertical GPU mount. Though priced at $89.99 in the US and £75 in the UK, it's almost as expensive as the H5 Flow itself, which comes in at $94.99 in the US, while the Elite comes in at $139.99, which is perfectly reasonable compared to similar cases on the market from Corsair and other leading brands. So with all of that out of the way, let's get down to the crux of it. How do they perform? Now, if you've not seen our video on how we test cases, I definitely advise taking a look so you can see how we test and the hardware that we use to make it as fair as possible. And the link for that is down below. So what we found at Idle was that the H5 Flow came in with the worst result we've seen. But my theory behind that really comes down to the lack of pre-installed fans in the front, and instead is reliant on that single fan at the bottom bringing in cool air, and that's clear to see in the testing. While the Elite, which has 2 pre-installed fans, fared better as expected at idle. When looking at the load temperatures during the Prime 95 and Thermark Torture test, the Flow did better here than the Elite, and kind of nestles in with the rest of the NZXT H7 cases. While the H5 Elite comes in a little hotter, but still within limits that are completely safe. Taking a look at our GPU, and again we see the Flow struggling slightly at idle with higher temperatures than any other case we've looked at, while the Elite comes in around 6 degrees cooler. And at load we actually see the Elite coming in with the same temperatures as the H510 Flow, while the H5 Flow manages to beat the slightly more expensive Corsair 4000D Airflow. When looking at the chipset, it's a similar story with the Flow giving us higher temperatures at idle, again with the only reason I can think of due to the lack of installed fans in the front, in its stock configuration. The Elite performs much better with similar idle temperatures to that of the H510 Flow, and then in terms of load, both fare pretty well considering all of the cases that beat them are generally more expensive, so make of that what you will. But again, all temperatures are reasonable in the grand scheme of things. When looking at the SSD temperatures, things didn't go great for the H5 Elite. Due to its glass design, it clearly hampers airflow, putting it as the worst we've seen. But at 53.5 degrees at load, it's nothing really worth worrying about. The H5 Flow, as expected, did better at 50 degrees during load, which puts it slightly better than the 4000D Airflow from Corsair, which again is a slightly more expensive case. During gaming, our CPU definitely fared slightly better within the Flow case, with very similar temperatures to its bigger brother, the H7 Flow, while the Elite ran less than 2 degrees hotter and actually ended up performing better than the H510 Flow, which may not sound like much, but when you consider that we're comparing a case dedicated to airflow and one with tempered glass, I'd say that's quite an achievement. The GPU temperatures were again very close, only separated by 2 degrees between the Flow and the Elite, with the H5 Flow besting the H510 Flow by just over 1 degree. Whatever the case, at below 50 degrees, it's nothing again really to worry about. Without sounding like a broken record, the H5 Flow and H5 Elite again come in performing very close to each other when looking at the temperatures of the chipset, and again sees an improvement over the H510 Flow, which I guess is what it's all about, making sure that there are improvements overall. Finally, when looking at the temperatures of our SSD, it's a bit too close to call, and we actually find the H510 Flow performing better, though at 46 degrees, I wouldn't be calling the fire brigade just yet. Now, having what I'd say as perfectly reasonable temperatures is one thing, but as I mentioned, the H5 series just seems a bit on the loud side of things when you first install your system and boot it up. And that's somewhat evident in our acoustic testing, where both H5 models performed within 0.8 of a decibel of each other at idle and 0.1 decibels at load, which puts both H5 cases towards the top of our charts, not for a good reason, with the H7 Elite being quite a lot louder in our testing. So with the testing, it's a little loud, but it is fixable based on the user, which I'm kind of okay with. That just goes to show the ability of the stock fan configuration and what an interesting configuration it is. Now, I personally would have liked to have seen another fan in the front of the H5 Flow, but I also get that it would have bumped its price up. I guess NZXT saw it as a bit of a trade-off, and while they could have put the fan in there instead of in the duct, I can only imagine how difficult it would have been to install a fan in that area, and I'm glad it's something I frankly don't have to do as a consumer. I do feel though that with the fans having the ability to push through up to 62 cubic feet per minute on the Flow and 89 on the Elite, that with components that generally get hotter and of course are larger, like the RTX 4090, we may see even better results due to that fan. But for the sake of keeping things consistent in our testing, we obviously had to use the components that we use in all of our case testing. So the H5 Flow and H5 Elite. Anyone who saw my thoughts on the H7 will immediately know pretty much what I'm about to say. I get the point of the H5 Elite. If you want RGB, ta-da, here it is. And you will be expected to pay for it, because not only are you getting RGB, but you're also getting larger fans as well. And along with it, an RGB controller, which, I don't know, at first thought, maybe it feels like you were being sold a bit short on, the controller, due to the fact that it only actually has 3 connectors. But with the ability to daisy chain NZXT fans, it's kind of a moot point for anyone wanting to add more RGB in at a later date, as that's kind of already been thought of, hence why it only has 3 connectors. So I think the H5 Elite will do well, because the kids love their RGB, and at $140 you are getting a lot of case for your money, even if it's a bit deceiving due to its size. Now, moving on to the H5 Flow, this is a bit of me. It looks nice, performs well, and has enough room for even the largest components, and it comes in at less than $100, which to me just ticks all the right boxes, as well as taking up a relatively small footprint in the mid-tower world. Now, with a little bit of tweaking to the fan curve, I think it's easy to oversee the noise complaint, as it then becomes a bit of a non-issue, and you're left with something that I'd easily say is one of the best mid-tower cases on the market right now. And I'm happy to see that NZXT have ditched the solid panel version for this range. I also love the fact that they're, breaking the mold a little with this ducted fan design. It just really does look cool. And it just goes to show that you can still make a big rectangular box exciting again with, just a dash of design flair, and without compromising in other areas, because that's normally the downfall with case manufacturers. You get nice things, but something has to give. And from what I can tell with the H5, you get all of the benefits with none of the trade-offs. So what do you think? Are you more of an airflow kind of person, or does the RGB on the Elite just tug at your wallet? I'd be eager to see what you guys think. And what do you think of the ducted fan design? I really, really like it. I mean, it's a bold move, but one that could potentially pay off in the long run. Personally, might just be me, it's nice to see a brand do something different, and I welcome that to the market. What about you? Let me know in the comments section below. And hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of special features, including behind the scenes content and access to a lot of our testing data. The link for that is down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye bye.